Do you like cheese? Well, my name is Kevin Beasley. I'm a professional cheesemonger, and welcome to my new series, A Complete Guide to Everything Cheese.
Yeah, CheeseWeeb.
So I'm starting this series with two goals in mind. One is to be able to provide one place in which if somebody decides that they wanted to learn how to become a cheesemonger, they could find a series and just watch the whole series and learn from that everything that they would need to know about the job, everything that they would need to know about cheese, or at least hopefully to set them up for the best possible pathway for them. And two, it is my dream to end starvation around the world. So the hope is that through this series, I'll be able to build a community to help work towards that goal. But I feel like a decent place to start is I mentioned that I'm a cheesemonger, but what is that exactly? So monger comes from the Latin word mongo, which means to sell or to trade or deal in something. For example, you have fishmonger, somebody who sells fish. You have a warmonger, somebody who trades in war. But I'm a cheesemonger, in my opinion, the best of the mongers.
I mean, it's alright, like...
Now, I've always been fascinated with human origins and where we come from, and maybe it's because I played a lot of Civilization. I think that's one of the reasons why I actually gravitated towards cheese, is because there's so much rich history with it that dates back to the beginning of where we come from. And since I've always been so fascinated with human origins, I feel like it's a decent place for us to start our journey in. Humans have been around for a long time, several 100,000 years at this point. Most of our content today is going to focus around the past 20,000 years or so. One of the things that sets humans apart from other animal species is that we have an ability to cultivate crops as well as master animal husbandry. Now, the history of animal husbandry and domestication of animals goes back quite a while. The earliest example of dogs, for example, dates back to around 30,000 BCE. But dogs would have been the first animal that we domesticated as humans, as dogs would have been a very immediate threat for early populations. Wild dogs, feral dogs, they posed a threat to the populace, as well as threatened the reserved food supplies, as dogs would have acted as scavengers as well. So the domestication of dogs very much came out of necessity, but there were also several benefits once we did domesticate them. For example, they would warn us if there were other predators coming nearby.
Surprise, motherfucker!
Stay on alert during the night hours. Much more sensitive to sound than we are, but we also have a very rich history of just loving critters and having little pets. So dogs would have been from around 15,000 BCE to 30,000 BCE. There's varying evidence across that whole time period, but the next animal that would have been domesticated would be cats.
Disconnected from the dead.
Cats would be a little bit different. Cats would be more of a development of a symbiotic relationship. So cats would notice that we started storing cereals and grains. More specifically, they would notice the rats that came around our cereals and grains, and so the cats would come and they would hunt the rats. And the people, and again, we love our critters, eventually noticed that the families and the houses that had cats protecting their grains had grains to spare. They were the more successful of the populations at the time period. And so humans and cats very much developed a symbiotic relationship where we would also take care of the cats by providing them food, but they were very much also there just to mess with the rats. And cats would have been domesticated somewhere around 12,000 BCE, again the point where we started collecting and reserving grains and cereals. The next animal that we would be finding would be sheep, as well as one of my favorite animals.
It's the Farhampton Boat Show!
Sheep and goats both would have been domesticated somewhere around 9,500 BCE to 8,000 BCE, so around 11 to 10,000 years ago at this point. But it is important to note that sheep and goats were actually domesticated before cattle because of their small size. Most of the populations at this time would have been seeking out natural shelters, such as caves for their source of shelter to protect them from the elements as well as predators. So because they had such a small space, they would have smaller animal options. But over time, as they've transitioned into a society much less like a hunter-gatherer and a much more sedentary lifestyle where they are cultivating their crops and they are now growing animals, we move into a new era of human development. One of my favorite quotes, and I don't exactly know who said it, maybe it's just me right now, you don't have time to play Stardew Valley if you're worrying about where your next meal is going to come from. So as they moved into a more sedentary lifestyle where they had a more consistent means of food, we also saw an increase in things like arts, an increase in things like technology advancements. A more sedentary lifestyle led more time to be allowed to pursue other means. As we became more sedentary, the need for permanent structures became more necessary, and so we began building houses for people and we began building our own shelters. Now that we are not secluded just to little caves, we have more open space. Eventually, the domestication of cattle was also brought forth around the 7000 BCE time period. Now, it's important to note most people would have a lactose intolerance. We did not yet have the natural immunity that a lot of people are able to benefit from today. We had not gone through the course of biology. We had not gone through the natural selection process yet. So at this time, a lot of people were unable to actually drink milk. And this is evidenced by the fact that most of the bones that we find at these early foundling sites are actually consisting mostly of the bones of the young adolescent cows, as opposed to mature cows that are able to produce milk of their own kind, that are able to produce offspring, for example. But for a long time, the animals that were actually being raised by these populations were simply being raised for meat production. You would have several older animals, and they had a very important purpose for these communities. Not only did they offer a consistent source of offspring to maintain your meat production, but they also provided a backup source of milk. Now, a lot of adults at this time are actually lactose intolerant. They actually don't have the gene necessary to produce lactase in their system, and so upon drinking milk, they shit.
You hear that? I can shit my pants for free.
Wow.
I just shipped my bed.
But babies actually produce lactase naturally, and so they would have a backup source of milk to be able to use for their young population as needed in times of famine or in case they didn't have anybody that was able to produce for a baby at the time. Now, over time, natural selection would take its course, and as people were forced to turn to milk in times of famine or disease or when they don't have enough resources to survive, you would have, unfortunately, people that would not be able to make it through the harsh conditions as they were poisoning themselves with the milk.
That would be inconceivable.
But you would have the people that had a natural lactose tolerance that would be able to use that milk to supplement themselves enough to survive, to be able to be physically fit enough for their environment. Those people would go on to live and pass down that gene, that trait of lactose tolerance onto their offspring. So over time, we were able to transition from using our animals mostly for meat to instead start using them for dairy production. Now I know what all you nasty little freaks are thinking. Who was the first person that went and messed around with an udder or a nipple from an animal to find out what was going on with these ruminants, these grass eaters? Well, luckily, observation would help a little bit. As we saw their offspring naturally go towards their mother's nipple or udder, we would find out that we were able to extract milk from those places as well. But I think the more important question, as opposed to just who went around messing with an udder, is actually who decided to take milk, let it rot to a point to where you could eat it as a different product. The definition of cheese, that is a solid food byproduct that comes from the acidification, coagulation, and fermentation of liquid dairy. But what does that actually mean, and how the hell did we find that out? There's a couple of different ideas. However, I've latched onto one story that I like, and I think it's just because it's a little bit more romantic in my mind. But the idea is that there's a traveler who's going down a main road, and this traveler has with him his water skin. His drinking vessel, his version of the Stanley. But he's got his water skin, he's traveling down the road, and his partner that morning was kind enough to fill it up for him with milk. Now, a water skin is traditionally made from the animal's stomach. So you take a young animal and you take their stomach. Any animal that we would be slaughtering during this time, again, we have the more youthful animals that we would raise up to a certain point and then slaughter for meat production. Those animals, we would try to make sure that everything they had got used. And so we would take their stomachs and turn them into drinking vessels. Well, there's this interesting thing where just like human babies have this protease called lactase that I mentioned earlier, that solidifies the milk into a solid so that way it takes a longer time going through the GI tract and being able to extract more nutrients out of it. Well, the collection of enzymes inside of an animal's stomach is something that we call rennet, but there's one specific protease in that mixture called chymosin that specifically is the curdling aspect during this process. And so the introduction of rennet, or this collection of enzymes, again mainly consisting of chymosin, acts as an organic acid, and through that acidification of the actual milk, you end up coagulating and everything comes together and turns into a solid. And so our traveler on the road, as he's walking down, his water skin is at his waist and it's been exposed to the natural organic acid inside of it. He's walking around, causing it to agitate and mix up, forcing everything to coagulate together, and it's being heated by the sun during this whole process, heating it up and creating a natural fermentation inside of the water skin, until eventually he takes off the lid, he throws it back, and boom, he's hit in the face with a bunch of cheese curds. Now in today's world, most cheese production is going to use lab-grown rennet, so we aren't slaughtering animals every time we want to make a wheel of cheese. Rennet can be found from fungus, can be found in various different plants, and of course can be found inside of animals. But essentially, again, rennet is the collection of various enzymes that act as a sort of starter culture. As that fermentation takes place, the cheese's lactose gets converted into lactic acid. One of my favorite examples of this is Parmigiano Reggiano. If you're familiar, it's Italy's most popular cheese, one of the most popular cheeses in the world, the king of cheese, as ordained by many of them.
What are you gonna do with it?
Eat it.
Eat it, the whole thing?
Yes,
Eat
the whole thing. Why is it? Can I not buy
Sell
it
your
for
junk?
Parmesan?
No,
Why?
because I say so.
But Parmigiano Reggiano has several different standards that have to be met in order to have the name of Parmigiano Reggiano. One of these standards is that it has to be specifically aged for 18 months. During this aging process, all of those starter cultures and the living microbacteria that is inside of the cheese is eating that lactose, that sugar, and is turning it into lactic acid. Because Parmigiano Reggiano is actually aged for that 18 months, that is long enough for all of the lactose to get converted to lactic acid, and thus Parmigiano Reggiano to this day is advertised as lactose free. A little note on lactose while we're on this subject. Typically, animals are going to have different amount of lactose to them. Water buffalo are going to have the most amount of lactose, followed by cows, followed by sheep and goats at the bottom. So for anybody who is lactose intolerant, me at the cheese counter, I typically offer extra aged Parmigiano Reggianos or extra aged cow's milk cheeses, but you can also offer a little bit more of a wider variety of sheep and goat's milk. Of course, this is going to be individualized to each person, but I have found success with offering especially aged goat cheeses and aged sheep cheeses to people that have a lactose intolerance, and they've reported back having loved the cheese and having no issue. That being said, I'm not a doctor. See your doctor for more specifics. All this to say though, typically rennet acts as an acid that helps curdle the milk along in the chemical processes. So that's generally believed how cheese was discovered. A happy accident through humans just living life. Some of the earliest actual cheeses would have been things similar to some of the cheeses that we see today out in the world. Kefir would have been one of the earliest options. Kefir is when you take the milk from the animal and you add in your microbiome, so your cultures, your bacteria, you add those into the milk and you allow it to ferment naturally in a fairly temperate place. Nowadays that would typically be in your refrigerator, but historically at the time that would have been in caves, a place where it's a much more cooler temperate space protected from the sunlight. Another cheese at the time that you would have seen would be something similar to cottage cheese. You would make cottage cheese by taking your milk, adding in your cultures, your bacteria, and then agitating that to allow it to mix together and to clump up and to come together into those solid proteins. So in cheese production, you have the whey, which is the leftover liquid that comes from when you separate out the liquid from the solids, and then you have the curds, which are the solid proteins left behind, in which you just take those solid curds and then you add some kind of salty dressing. This would have been functional for two purposes. Not only does it make it tasty, but salt is also acting as a natural preservative. You would also see something similar to ricotta. In Italian, ricotta means recooked, but that is actually because you take that leftover whey that we talked about and you add in some kind of acidifier to it, lemon juice, or distilled white vinegar, and you allow those solid proteins to form again out of the whey, and then you take that and strain it again, and at this point you, I guess, have inception whey coming out of it. But you take your solid proteins and that's your ricotta cheese that you have, again, recooked. But most of the cheese of the time would have been very similar to cream cheese or fresh goat cheeses that you see today. Now, one of the most important parts about cheese making was our use of tools at the time, specifically ceramics. But as I mentioned earlier, as we had more time for freedom to focus on other things, we also had time to devote towards advancing other technologies. So the actual earliest evidence of cheese making that we have at the moment dates back to about 5200 BCE, so at this point about almost 7,000 years ago. But in Poland, at some of these early foundling sites across Europe, they found ceramic sieves, essentially like strainers made out of pottery, but they are covered with milk proteins. But this would be a direct example of people using strainers to separate out the whey from the solids and then taking those solids to be used for other purposes. The next earliest evidence that we would see of cheese comes from China. Please forgive the pronunciation. I believe it's pronounced Zhaohu Cemetery in China. There is a 1615 BCE. They found cheese, specifically kefir, smeared over the faces of mummies inside of a tomb. Egypt also has a very rich history with cheese. University of Cairo in 2018 found a 3,200-year-old cheese at the Saqqara necropolis. But they also have earlier evidence of cheese making, as you can find it in their tax records that they kept track of. You can find it in murals across various tombs. You can find it written and reported as a part of funeral meals for some of their royalty. Now, Greek mythology has two of my favorite examples of, you have Aristeus, who is a mythological culture hero, but he is accredited with the discovery of cheese making, beekeeping, handicrafts, basically all of my favorite things. Anything an ADHD little autistic gremlin would enjoy. Now, before Christopher Nolan had his hands dipped in the Odyssey, originally it was a book written in the 8th century BCE. Polyphemus was a cyclops born of Poseidon, but Polyphemus kept sheep and goats. He was a shepherd on his island. He kept sheep and goats, mixed their milk together, pressed them, and is actually accredited with the origination of feta cheese. Now, by the time Rome comes around, cheese making is already starting to hit its stride. We're seeing more specialized cheese, we're seeing different types of cheese becoming more popular, but Rome is actually most well known for Pecorino Romano. I've got to be honest with you, Pecorino Romano is one of my least favorite cheeses. It's really, really salty. It's got quite a lot of flavor to it. It can sometimes come across more astringent. I might be biased. I had this nightmare scenario happen one day at work. The Pecorino Romano comes in a wheel about 60 pounds heavy. It's a huge wheel of cheese made entirely from sheep's milk. But we had a wheel show up one day at work, and I opened up the box and I pulled it out inside of the vacuum sealed bag that it comes in. And upon pulling it out, normally the vacuum sealed bag is vacuum sealed. However, this time it was very puffy. Filled up with air, I was confused as to why it was like that. My assumption was that at some point during the process of transporting it to our location, it had gone under a secondary fermentation, creating gases that built up inside of this Pecorino Romano. Again, a very salty, at this point, very ammoniated and very astringent Pecorino Romano. So my dumbass, I walked over and said, well, we've got to try it somehow, make sure it's okay, see if we can sell it or not. And so I walked over and I had a knife in my hand and I had my hand on the bag, not thinking, and I poked a little hole in the bag to be able to start cutting a tear into it. And upon that happening, all the pressure from my hand just was too much and it pushed the air out, and that little hole was pointed right towards the back of my brain stem, and all of that air just got I don't know the lasting effects of this. Hopefully it's fine. But Pecorino Romano was actually the staple food used by the Roman armies. Cheese, as we've talked about, is the collection and coagulation of proteins. Cheese is a very protein-heavy food. This specific Pecorino Romano, very dense, very tightly packed. But you end up with a food that not only has a high calorie count, but also has a lot of protein in it. Perfect for a Roman legionnaire. Now, with the ending of the Roman Empire, there was a period of time in which there was a lot of decentralized power, especially in Europe, as there was a big power vacuum to be filled. As we saw feudalism come in and usher in a new era of dividing people into territories that then compete against each other, we also saw a much stronger ushering in of now the Catholic Church. But this very much began the very rich history between cheese making and monks. Monks have a lot of time on their hands, and so they devoted a lot of their time towards various crafts like cheese making, meadery, making alcohols. And throughout the next several hundreds of years, monks would be creating many different varieties of cheese. For example, brie in the 7th century. In the 9th century in Italy, you have gorgonzola appearing, the blue cheese that's very strong, that one.
We've got the Munster, the Gouda, the Brie.
Do you have any stinky cheese?
You cops.
Gorgonzola actually has a nice little romantic story, at least I think it's a cute little story. A cheesemaker was working on his cheese one night, and then he heard from his boo thing that she wanted to hang out, and the young cheesemaker, being in love, he said, "Oh, absolutely." And so he left his evening curds unattended, and he walked away, and he left them that evening, and he came back the next day, and he found that he had his new curds, and hoping to hide his mistake, he took the day-old curds and added them into the new curds. Well, after the process of fermentation and the aging of the cheese, blue mold had started growing in between the slots of the old and new curds. There's actually a lot of stories of young cheesemakers being in love and that influencing their cheese making. That'll be a good video at some point during the series. But as time moves on, you also have monks working on things like Munster, the very stinky French cheese, which came about sometime during the 9th century at the Munster Abbey. A lot of cheeses are named after the places that they came from. And finally, as we get to the thousands, you've got Roquefort, another French cheese, this one a blue French cheese, but has been around since about 1070, I believe. Moving into the 1100s, we also have the discovery of one of my favorite cheeses, Gruyere. Made in Switzerland from cow's milk, Gruyere is a very delicious savory cheese, but again, this is another option made by monks. And then in the 13th century, you have the invention of Parmigiano Reggiano, again by monks. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting about this process is over the centuries and over the years, we see an increase in the size of the actual cheese wheels. So for example, Brie, Munster, Camembert, these are all going to be fairly small cheeses compared to a cheese like Parmigiano Reggiano or Gruyere, each being about 80 or 60 pounds respectively. So not only does this occur because of the technological advances that we were making during this time period, but also as a result of our selective breeding and again our animal husbandry skills that we've just been displaying. As we've been working with sheep, goats, cattle, buffalo, various ruminants over the years, we've been selectively breeding them to produce more milk over time. And from here, for lack of a better words, the rest is history. As time went on, we went on to develop more and more different varieties of cheeses. Depending on where you are in the world, you have a different access to select cultures that your animals are going to be eating. As your animals eat different bacteria or cultures, these are going to lend themselves to different properties into the pH of the cheese, into the moisture levels of the cheese. But as humans spread out and covered the entire world, all of our ruminants that we brought along with us, our cows, sheep, goats, etc., they had different bacteria and culture to eat from. But that's essentially how we discovered cheese. So if you made it this far in the video, genuinely from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. It means so much to me that you would stick around for so long, and I hope you'll consider subscribing. This is just the first part of the cheese series that I'm going to be putting together, but next time we're going to be starting in on the actual individual families of cheese and doing a deep dive into each one of them and talking about what makes them what some of the most popular cheeses are, how to work with those cheeses, and how to actually pair those cheeses up if you're going to be hosting for a party. What flavors work best together? Again, the goal of this series is to be a complete guide to everything cheese. So, I'll see you next time.